MagicCon Chicago sure took us on a wild ride, as not only did Pro Tour Aetherdrift give us the first look at the pro player perspective on the upcoming limited format for the new set, but it also gave us a standard showcase that we're not soon to forget. 348 players entered the room, and there were a plethora of decks on the floor that we get to go through in this video, and there's just a lot to cover. So we're just going to kick it off with a recap of the top 8. Then we're going to go into just the metagame breakdown of what was in the room in MagicCon Chicago at the Pro Tour event. What were the most popular decks and how did those specific decks perform? And then shifting gears a little bit to look at the top 10 decks as far as their win rate was concerned. And then at the end of it all, we're going to cross the finish line by looking at the head-to-head matchup matrix between the 10 most present decks in the room, so that you can take this standard prep and apply it to the rest of your RCQ season. So sit tight, buckle up, we're going to take a wild ride through Pro Tour Aetherdrift. 348 players whittled down to a top 8 that featured 3 of a similar archetype of deck in the Domain Overlords list, which took the Xur Overlords package, smashed it into the Domain package, and kind of took out some of the things that we'd normally expect to see from Domain, like the Atraxas and the Calls and things like that, but kept the removal package and more of the control playstyle, while also giving it just a ridiculously aggressive, ahead of the curve style plan with Xur and the Overlords. So we're 3 copies of that in the top 8, as well as 2 copies of the Gruul deck, although a little bit different, as there was a version of the deck that was Gruul Mice, which is actually going a little bit bigger than the traditional aggro decks to go around things like Nowhere to Run from the bounce enchantment decks like Pixie and Dimir, but then also a Gruul Leyline deck, which is more of the standard affair of pretty much straight up Gruul aggro with the Leyline of Resonance, so that we can get double cast of our spells on certain creatures as we're turning things sideways and getting aggressive. Now there were 2 of those decks in the top 8, but there was also a mono red aggro deck which cut the green and was kind of very similar to some of the older red aggressive decks that we saw in earlier iterations of the standard format, as well as a bit of a blast from a past in Jeskai Oculus, splashing yet another color into the Azorius shell in order to make the deck a little bit more resilient in specific matchups. As our top 8 unfolded, however, it did kind of seem like one of the deck archetypes had the other one's numbers. And as we played throughout the quarterfinals, we can see that in the first of them, Matt Nass's Domain deck actually took down Ian Rob's mono red aggro deck in a game score of 3-1-0. And of course, these are all best of 5 matches, so you get 2 pre-board games and 3 post-board games. So seeing the aggro deck, which is kind of fine-tuned for these more control-y and slow matchups like the Xur Domain deck, losing the first 2 pre-board games is a little bit of a tale of how these games actually went. In the second quarterfinal, we saw Christopher Leonard's Domain deck also take down yet another aggressive deck in the Gruul Leyline deck, which was piloted by Lucas Deco. That was another 3-1-0 series. And then the other Domain deck in the top 8 was also able to take down the Jeskai Oculus deck. And so that one was going to be James Dimitrov's Domain Overlords taking down Kenta Harane's Jeskai Oculus deck. And then the fourth and final quarterfinal, there was no Domain deck. However, it was Gruul Mice piloted by Yuchen Liu going up against the Zevin Faust Golgari Graveyard deck, which was something we saw at the Magic Spotlight series in Atlanta, kind of come back to the PT and put up a top 8 result. Unfortunately, it was not able to put up a top 4 or further result, as the Gruul Mouse deck won a grueling series, no pun intended, 3-0, as the Golgari Graveyard deck and their Souls the Lost tech for this matchup just wasn't enough to take down a full 5-game series. The semifinals pit 2 Domain decks against one another, and it was Matt Nass again who came out ahead in this Domain mirror 3-1-0 to earn the first spot in the finals. Where on the flip side, it was Domain versus Gruul, yet another one of those aggressive matchups that was looking to kind of prey on these Domain decks. Unfortunately, it was going to be the Domain deck that came out ahead in this matchup again, 3-0, so a close 5-game series, but that set Matt and James on a collision course in the finals for a Domain mirror match head-to-head, which did go the distance in a full 5-game series where we saw Math Nass very carefully calculating lethal, if that's what you want to call it, in Game 5 to take James from almost 60 down to 0 and earn Matt Nass the Pro Tour Aetherdrift trophy. So we've had a bit of a TLDR of the top 8, but let's go back in time a little bit and expand our view of Pro Tour Aetherdrift and take a look at all of the decks in the room. Now, I do have to give a little bit of a caveat to the data before we wind up looking at the entire metagame for the event, just so we have a little bit of perspective on things like this. Now, I am using the Melee platform numbers again because they are most easily accessible to me, which counts 348 registered players, all of them with deck lists that have archetypes that I'm trusting the names of because this is a Pro Tour and I'm going to match what we've seen on coverage as far as what the archetypes were called and stuff. So in the example of the top 8, there is a Gruul Mice and a Gruul Leyline deck. Those had distinguishing features to their list, one of them having the Leyline and more of the single target pump spells, and the other one still having the Mice package and some of those pump spells, but then going a little bit bigger with cards like Innkeeper's Talent and different sideboard choices. So we stuck to the deck archetype naming convention that the Pro Tour did wind up having. Now, the other thing I do want to mention is since this is a Pro Tour event, half of the event was draft, half of the event was standard. We are only looking at the standard rounds, which still gives us double-digit amounts of rounds in order to look at the results for this. However, with a smaller size tournament only being 348 compared to like the 1200 plus or 1800 plus events that we've had for Spotlight Series and other events, this is going to be small by comparison, which means that the sample size will of course be very small, and you need to keep that in mind as this will not be a be-all tell-all of what standard is on a grand scene of things. The last thing that you have to remember from this is, of course, the fact that since this is a pro level event and there are going to be much fewer matches, there are going to wind up being players who eventually get buys in the event. Matt Nass was the first one to qualify and then wound up getting buys for the rest of his rounds once he hit the amount of match points that he needed. Now, in order to compensate for this and not inflate the numbers of those deck archetypes, I have considered to discount all buys in the win rates for the decks. So that means if you got a buy because you've already qualified for the top 8, your deck archetype does not reflect that win, nor does it reflect that match at all. Now, to make things easier on the calculations, I have done that for every player that got a buy earlier in the tournament as well. So if you were just last place and your deck wound up getting a buy because there were players that dropped out or you were an odd number player at the event, your win there does not count towards the deck archetype's win total as well. So with all that technical mumbo jumbo surrounding the data out of the way, let's take a step back and look at the high level metagame breakdown of all of the deck archetypes in the room at Pro Tour Aetherdrift. 19 decks had a single copy in the room, which made up a whopping 40.4% of decks played at the event. Just going to show that there were quite a few players that chose to either brew something new or go against what everyone else was looking to play. Now we'll take a look at some of these lists that wound up performing well a little bit later on. Only a single deck archetype had 2 copies in the event, making Izzet Artifacts 4.3% of the room all by itself. Now, there were 7 deck archetypes that had at least 3 copies at Chicago, accounting for 14.9% of the field played, while there were 5 different archetypes that had at least 4 copies sleeved up and ready to go, speaking for 10.6% of the metagame. The remainder of the decks had at least 7 copies or more at the Pro Tour, making up 31.9% of the field. So overall, while there were more decks in the room of these archetypes, the number of archetypes compared to the size of the field was pretty varied at Pro Tour Aetherdrift. Now, at the tip top of the metagame were 3 decks that dwarfed the others in the competition with the number of decks that were played. Gruul Mice had 66 total decks at the Pro Tour, making up the largest share of the metagame at 19% even, while Esper Pixie had a 16.7% of the meta share with 58 copies being played. Third place was a deck that had fallen off previously, but surged back to 53 copies at the Pro Tour in Domain, only this time with an emphasis on the Zur and Overlord package with a 15.2% of the metagame share. Just outside the top 3 archetypes is Jeskai Oculus with 20 decks and a 5.7% metagame share, although there were 2 or 3 distinct lists being run by a couple of different teams that we'll go over fully later on. Now, cousin decks of Gruul and Pixie in mono red aggro and Dimir bounce had lesser representation in the overall metagame, while Gruul Leyline, also related to the Gruul Mice deck, put 7 copies into the event for a 2% metagame share, playing, like we said, a similar list to the Mice package, but keeping more of those pump spells in the main deck to make the explosive Leyline turns that much better. Now, other interesting archetypes include Azorius Omniscience at 2% with 7 decks, Esper Paragon playing Sarah Paragon alongside some of the best hits of the bounce package with the same 7 decks and 2% share of the metagame, as well as personal favorites of mine in Golgari Roots and Golgari Obliterator with 4 decks of the Pro Tour for a 1.1% metagame share. Now, sticking to the theme of what was played in larger quantities, let's move over to looking at decks based on their popularity tier, which is a metric that I've created to rank decks based on the average number of all archetypes at an event, from the tip top of S tier down to the bottom at D tier. Now, they earn a higher ranking by being further away from that average number when placed on a normal distribution. So basically, this is a standard deviation that gives insight into how popular a deck truly is and how frequently you may encounter it at your own RCQ or LGS events. Now, you could probably see this just from the metagame breakdown, but the 3 S-tier decks are the ones that took up the double-digit metagame share numbers: Gruul Mice, Esper Pixie, and Domain Overlords. Now, of these 3 decks, Domain had the higher win rate with an average of 54%, while Esper Pixie was the only deck out of these S tiers that had a below average win rate on the weekend, which is a stark contrast from earlier standard events of this year. Now, decks packing hate cards like Pest Control or Temporary Lockdown definitely put a damper on the shenanigans that the Pixie deck could pull off, considering the very low mana cost the deck has overall. Gruul Mice continued to put up good numbers with a slightly above 50% win rate while being the most popular deck in the room, so that's extremely impressive. There were versions of decks that skewed the removal packages towards fighting against Gruul Mice, and we'll look into how this affected the head-to-head matchups a little bit later on. But overall, the Mice deck continues to power on as one of the go-to aggro decks in the format. Now, we're actually going to be jumping all the way down to the C tier, since there was such a gap between the top 3 most played decks and everything else at the event that the math just broke down this way, where we find all of the decks that had 8 or more copies in the room. Now, of all of these decks, mono red aggro surged back to the top of the win rate column with a 55.6% average across all 11 pilots that it had at the PT, with lesser numbers than Gruul but a better overall win rate record. Now, the Jeskai Oculus list also combined for a 51.8% win rate on the weekend, making the deck look like a solid choice for events in the near future. Now, the rest of the decks, including the Azorius cousin to the Jeskai Oculus deck, all clocked in at under 50% win rate, marking a below average weekend performance. Although none of them had it worse than poor Dimir Midrange. The once powerhouse deck of the format ended with a 26.8% win rate in the standard portion of the PT. All right, now since we got cheated out a little on the popularity tiers, I want to take a minute to highlight 2 different lists that we talked about briefly and dive a little bit deeper into each of them for a moment. Now, I mentioned a little bit earlier, but both the Domain Overlords deck and the Jeskai Oculus lists had multiple versions of the archetype floating around the Pro Tour this weekend, but were lumped together in the archetype breakdown. Now, for Domain, it was a little less of an egregious split, since the main difference that I want to look at is the list that ended up running 4 copies of Ride's End, which is a new removal spell from Aetherdrift, and decks that ran less than 4 main deck copies or none at all. Now, this was mainly sparked by a discussion in one of my Discord channels, but at the end of the day, it looks to be an extremely close call between the two. Now, the decks that ran 4 copies ended up with a tiny bit higher win rate overall at 54.7%, while decks opting for less to no copies clocked in at a 53.3% win rate. Now, there were 6 more decks that chose not to run the full 4 copies of the card than ran the full 4 of, while those slots that would have been Ride's End were replaced by other removal spells like Elspeth's Smite that do play a very similar role. It's just that they can't kill things like a pumped up Heartfire hero cleanly, and despite being 1 mana all of the time, will not ever proc your up the beanstalk the way that Ride's End can. Now, all of these options were innovations on trying to shore up these aggressive matchups like the Gruul and Mono Red decks were, since this is usually a weaker part for the domain decks to play against, while providing a low mana exiling effect that, like I mentioned, would hopefully trigger their up the beanstalks. Meanwhile, the Jeskai Oculus lists were split in a few different directions. Now, predominantly the Japanese team, although there were some others at the event, brought a version that looked to play Inti, Seneschal of the Sun, alongside Fear of Missing Out and Steam Core Scholar, upping the discard synergy and giving extra ways to do things in the combat step. Meanwhile, the TCG Player Channel Fireball team brought a version that swapped out Inti for Stormchaser's talent and ran This Town Ain't Big Enough synergy as well, putting a bounce style game plan into the deck. Now, yet another version of the deck, although only from 2 players total, looked to try to leverage Prof's eidetic memory to the max by reanimating Phyrexian Dragon Engine to discard and draw a ton of cards and provide the double striker with trample granted from Inti. Now, of all these versions of the deck, the Inti version had the highest win rate, rivaling the win rates of Domain and Mono Red aggro at 54.7%. Now, the version looking to leverage the bounce package also wasn't that bad, having an above average win rate at 50.9% or 51.9% if you don't count the ties that it had, while the Dragon Engine version, though, unfortunately was a below average performance for that version of the deck, clocking in at just a 40% win rate at the Pro Tour. Now, while we got our minds on talking about good win rates, let's hop on over to the top 10 decks based on that win rate metric without accounting for how many copies of the deck were in the room. Now, this is just to highlight not only standout performances, but also give light to some decks that did well overall in the standard portion, but may not be as represented in the metagame breakdowns just by not having this sheer number of decks that other ones had. Now, remember in at looking these win rates that sample size is key, so decks with small numbers aren't just like sleeper OP decks that people didn't think about. They're just decks that did well this weekend that might warrant a bit more testing to see if they are the real deal. Basically, these are a great spot for brewers in the format to get some ideas, and then decks with multiple copies are a good start for people who are grinding RCQs to jump on over to, or people that are getting into the format to try out and understand. Starting off, we have Ben Stark's Orzhov take on the Pixie deck, kind of going back to the OG package, only foregoing the blade and braids part of the equation, much to my dismay. Now, playing the shell like a control deck where Ben was able to leverage Unholy Annex, Liliana the Veil, and Temporary Lockdown alongside Nurturing Pixie and Hopeless Nightmare to push through damage, locked people out of games from their hand, killed their board state, and provided the deck with card advantage angle that could also spawn a 6/6 flying demon. Now, with an 80% win rate overall, or 88.9% win rate without the tie factored in, Ben had an almost perfect run of standard on the weekend. Now, another 80% win rate deck was the almost forgotten This Town Ain't Big Enough deck that started it all. That's right, the Temur Otters combo deck. Now, I'm apologizing for mispronouncing the name, but Jacopo Battalini played out the combo of Enduring Vitality, Valley Floodcaller, Looping Stormchaser's talent, and This Town Ain't Big Enough to make a whole bunch of mana, make infinitely large otters and rats, and then swing in for lethal with haste thanks to Song of Totentans. So the OG Otter deck with this Stormchaser's talent and This Town Ain't Big Enough loop is still destroying standard, just in much smaller numbers. 1 to be exact. Now, a deck archetype with 7 copies in the room takes the 3rd spot in win rate overall, with top performance from Arne Huschenbeth finishing in 12th place overall while going 9-1-0 in this standard portion of the event, and that is Azorius Control. Now, similar to Domain's style of deck, Temporary Lockdown and Ride's End give Azorius Control more exile-based removal against the aggressive decks, while a Jerry T favorite new card in Stock Up does an amazing dig through time light impression, finding 2 of the top 5 as probably the best divination variant we've ever seen. Sorry, quick study. Now, overall, the Azorius Control archetype had a 62.7% win rate on the weekend, with a 66.1% overall if you don't count the 3 ties that it wound up having, which is unfortunately something that will happen when you play the control deck. Now, there were 3 decks tied at a 60% win rate, both with and without ties accounted for. So let's start off with the one that had the most copies in the room, which is the Bant Cage deck. Now, this deck utilized a package of cards like a Solar Flare deck and a Collected Company deck had a baby. So if that excites you, stay tuned and take a look at this. The deck could also flip into cards with its Collector's Cage extremely early on. Now, the main card that you want to see underneath your Collector's Cage is Bright Glass Gearhulk, functioning as a tutor of sorts for a toolbox of 1-drop creatures, enchantments, and artifacts, but mostly to find a Mockingbird so you can copy your Gearhulk and do it all over again. In fact, you can do it up to 3 or 4 more times depending on just how many Mockingbirds you have in your list, and then you have an army of flying Gearhulks in addition to eventually ending with like Shard Mage's protection or something to keep your Gearhulks flying and alive on the battlefield. Next up is a 5-color Legends list piloted by Jay Wojciechowski, which is a deck I played around with quite a bit pre-Aetherdrift release. Now, although this version of the deck lacks the crime package that I wound up taking from a Haruria site deck, Jay traded in Tiny Bones Joins Up for the larger and much more deadly Rakdos Joins Up to not only reanimate something, but make it so all of our Legends dying dome our opponents for damage. Now, the main way to kill someone isn't just the normal combat route, which, is still there, but instead revolves around Rona, Herald of Invasion, Relic of Legends, and Honest Rutstein, allowing you to loop 2 copies of Rutstein, tapping Rona and the copy on your field for mana with the Relic, and then legend ruling your opponent to death with Rakdos Joins Up and Honest Rutstein. Now, the deck does have a backup plan for Graveyard Hate, though, which is, just tap all your Legends for mana and dump Atraxa Grand Unifier onto the table extremely ahead of schedule. Now, there was an Izzet Artifacts deck that actually had 2 copies played at the PT, with only one of the lists going 7-3 and landing pilot Remy Rudier a 60th place finish overall at the event. Now, the deck is built around Repurposing Bay, which is the artifact birthing pod of sorts that allows the deck to climb up the ladder towards a Boommobile and Radiant Lotus, leveraging a lot of mana from all the artifacts you have laying around to smack an opponent in the face for lethal damage. Now, the deck also packs things like Legion Extruder and Simulacrum Synthesizer so that you can generate an army of golems and constructs if combat damage needs to be prevented or actually dealt, because you can play a bunch of these artifacts out, sacrifice them for golems, make a bunch of constructs, continue to play the smaller ones that don't trigger the Simulacrum Synthesizer or make tokens off of some of your other artifacts, and just go to town with creatures that are just going to be increasing in size, all while threatening to pod them into your sort of combo finish. Now, Azorius Omniscience is another blue-white deck that put up results this weekend, although the combo that we've seen before instead of being a straight-up control deck. We've seen this at the MSS event before, but this deck uses Abuela's Awakening to get Omniscience into play as soon as possible, and the deck has a lot of card selection, such as the aforementioned new card Stock Up, and stall tactics like Temporary Lockdown, so it can find its invasion of Archveus to grab Season of Weaving, and make an infinite army of Omniscience flying tokens. Now, with a 56.7% win rate overall on the weekend in the hands of 7 different pilots, this might be the combo deck of choice to build if you're into that style of gameplay. Mono Red Aggro slots in 8th overall with 11 decks in the room and a solid 55.6% win rate we hit on a little bit earlier. Now, capping the tournament with a top 8 performance from Ian Robb, the deck didn't get anything new from Aetherdrift to power it up, but instead just found itself in a really solid spot for the PT metagame. The deck is still packing the Mice, Screaming Nemesis, and Monastery Swiftspear package, but Mono Red just went face for a whole weekend and was rewarded for it kind of handsomely. Former Player of the Year Simon Nielsen was the highest placing of the 7 Jeskai Convoke pilots this weekend, adding Nesting Bot to the go wide token strategy of the format, as well as some lists leaning into Regal Bunnicorn for some extra power. Now, the Convoke shell also got to leverage a solid sideboard option in Wilt Leaf Liege from Foundation's reprints, as its anti-pixie tech, as forcing the deck to discard a card, now powered up all of its white tokens and put creatures like Novice Inspector and Warden of the Inner Sky out of range of cards like Pyroclasm or Malicious Eclipse in the process. Lastly, we have what is the main deck of the event in Domain Overlords, walking away with the 10th slot in win rate overall, while still having the 3rd most decks played at the event. Now, we've already talked a bunch about the deck and its multiple configurations, but leaning on the power of Up the Beanstalk, Zur, and the assortment of band-colored Overlords, looks like it's going to be a deck to beat if you're prepping for your own RCQs over the next month or so. That's where the top win rate decks fell. Now let's shift gears, up our speed as we drive towards the top 10 presence decks and take a look at how they all stacked up in their head-to-head matches. Now, by looking at this snapshot of the metagame up close and personal, you can get an idea of what decks you may want to play and get a high-level understanding of how they may play out against one another. Now, just to note, the Pro Tour not only has some of the best players in the world playing, but there's also a smaller number of them attending. So that means that sample size will be a little small, or in some cases, not have any matches at all. So this is not a be-all, end-all ranking of how these matches may go. Gruul Mice had a solid matchup into any number of these slower decks, including a 59.3% overall win rate against the tournament-winning Domain Overlords archetype. However, it struggled a little bit against decks that were doing something faster or responding to its things better. Now, Golgari is the go-to quote-unquote beat mice deck that packs removal after removal, which gave the deck a bit of trouble here and there as well, with a 52.9% win rate against the green-black shell. Now, it also had a harder time against the Oculus decks, putting larger things into play sooner than it could do anything, and the mono-red version of the aggro deck, as the Gruul deck has slowed down its strategy for consistency, while red will often curve out more aggressively and can be a little bit more explosive. Esper Pixie was a bit of the opposite of Gruul, taking advantage in their direct head-to-head, but struggling against some of the slower decks, specifically the tournament-winning Domain Overlords deck, where temporary lockdown and giving its creatures hexproof by Zur made the bounce strategy difficult to pull off consistently. Now, it also seemed to struggle against the Jeskai versions of the Oculus deck, which, depending on the version, could be looked at as a color-shifted mirror. Now, Pixie, however, did demolish the other top decks in the room, continuing to make mid-range shells like Dimir and Golgari look a little silly, while also putting up a winning record against the Selesnya version of the Collector's Cage deck. Domain Overlords won the whole thing, but wasn't entirely impervious to the metagame. A control deck at heart, it still struggled against the aggressive red decks, with only a 37.5% win rate against the mono-red version of the aggro decks. Against all the other top decks though, Domain was an incredible metagame call, as the next quote-unquote bad win rate was 60% against the Jeskai Oculus decks, which, I'm being sarcastic. That is a extremely high win rate to have, especially against the 4th most played archetype in the room at a Pro Tour. As we get lower down the matrix, we start hitting those decks in the C tier popularity numbers, and therefore we'll run into some matches where we don't have a lot of data. Now, unfortunately, the Jeskai Oculus deck has 2 of these head-to-heads where there's no games played, but the rest of its games will let it know how it did against the lower monocurve decks in the room like Gruul and Esper Pixie, while it struggled a little bit with a 40% win rate against Domain. Now, smaller sample sizes show us that the 2 matches against Golgari midrange were losses. It might be something to look out for if you're expecting any of those style of decks at your own LGS and you want to take this Jeskai list for a spin. Now, personally, I really like the Japanese players version of the deck using Inti. I know I'm a bit of an Inti simp, but I still think having that discard synergy is a very powerful thing to do, and I would be looking at running that version over the bounce version of the deck because I don't know how much different that is going to be in power level compared to the Pixie deck, which is already pretty good against most things besides the Domain deck, where this one doesn't necessarily have that much better of a Domain matchup in the first place. Now, we've already touched on how mono red looked against the slower decks and the semi-mirrors, but what kept the deck down overall was really the Pixie and Oculus decks of all color variants. Meanwhile, it put up some unexpected 100% win rates in a few of the matches that it played against the traditional Dimir and Golgari midrange decks, which for a deck that was largely untouched in construction for a few months is quite impressive, especially since those decks were playing against it all those months ago, and while mono red was still strong back then, those other decks were also very strong. The Azorius version of Oculus didn't get to play Inti, nor did it get access to the red removal spells, but it continued to reanimate Haughty Djinns alongside the Flying Eyeball to success against the Gruul and Pixie decks, but not so much into the Domain deck, which seemingly had its number. A small amount of matches against the other top decks in the room is a little inconclusive, except being solid in the 2 matches it played against Dimir Bounce, which we would expect to be similar to the way the Esper Pixie matchup would go, since the basis of those 2 decks is very similar, and the white splash in the Pixie deck, especially main deck, is usually just for the namesake Pixie card. Speaking of Dimir Bounce, the deck that did extremely well at the MSS in Atlanta had a bit of a rude reception in Chicago, struggling against all 3 of those S-tier popularity decks, with a 31.3% win rate into the event-winning Domain Overlords deck. It didn't have too many matches against the other top decks in the room, although a 1-2 record into the Selesnya Cage deck could be something to keep on your radar if you start seeing that green-white deck pick up in popularity and you're still playing the Dimir Bounce deck yourself. And if you think Dimir Bounce had a bad weekend, Dimir Midrange had it even worse for wear, not even winning a single match against the Gruul Mice deck, struggling against the Esper Pixie and Domain decks both, although it had an ever so slightly higher win rate than its bounce deck brethren against the Overlords deck with a 37.5% win rate. I just think the slower, steadier version of the Dimir deck, this mid-range shell, its time has kind of passed, and it either needs to have some sort of overhaul to either shift away from the tempo style, go into more control, and beat up on some of the decks that are banking on the fact that you can stall on cards and put things like stock up in there so you have some card selection, or you need to kind of just go towards the bounce shell, be a little bit faster, and have the redundancy of Storm Chaser's talent in this town ain't big enough to carry you through some of these matches. Now, Golgari wasn't great this weekend, but it did do what it set out to do, which was beating Gruul. But it couldn't really consistently do the same against Esper Pixie with a below average 44.4% win rate in that head-to-head. Now, with a deck packing plenty of removal and opting for less and less kind of hand disruption and interaction, the Golgari deck was an unfortunate victim of the uptick in Domain at the Pro Tour, having just a 28.6% win rate in the head-to-head against the event-winning deck. This is nothing new. The Golgari list has often struggled against that deck specifically, basically since it's board wipes, control, and then drops a couple of big things on you. But the one thing that the green splash in these black mid-range decks does give you is Terra Sunder. So if you are a Golgari mid-range player, you may want to be packing some extra copies of that just to deal with the Overlords in general, and then make sure you can save your cut downs and those removal spells for Xur to make them vulnerable. Selesnya Cage, which used the same Gearhulk Cage synergy that the Bant deck took to a top 10 win rate performance, didn't quite have the same success when it went head to head against the top decks in the room, and it only really stacked up to the Gruul Mice, Jeskai Oculus, and Dimir Bounce decks. Now, playing a lot of small creatures, especially ones that are 1 mana or so in order to tutor them with your Gearhulk, does not line up well into Temporary Lockdown, which echoes true in the 25.0% win rate that Selesnya Cage had against the Domain Overlords deck in Chicago. Now, while this deck can swarm the board and go pretty wide while also having some powerful synergies, I do like the Bant shell for having Mockingbird to put a bunch of big things on the battlefield, so that if you ever do get into one of these matchups where Temporary Lockdown style cards are key, your deck doesn't just fold to them because you can start copying Gearhulks as soon as your turn 4 or 5 with Mockingbird. Aetherdrift was sure a bit of a wild ride at the Pro Tour this time around, and there were lots of decks that were in the room, but not every single one of them was in the hands of multiple people. Now, as it is still standard RCQ season, there are a lot of different decks that you can try to dive into by looking at the Melee platform link and trying to look at the deck list and see if you figured out something that might be a little bit under the radar or underplayed in your eyes for your own RCQ season, or you could go back and take a look at the top 10 win rate section of this video to try to figure out if there's something that you may want to play around with. However, if you are grinding standard RCQs and still looking for your invite or second invite, since you can do that now, let me know in the comments down below what you're going to be taking to your LGS in order to battle it out in standard. Now, while you're down there, you can of course give the video a thumbs up so that myself and the YouTube algorithm gods know that you enjoy all of these recaps that I'm doing on these pro level events. Of course, I do want to take a moment to shout out the members of my channel, because their devotion and their support has made videos like this one, as well as all the videos on my channel, possible because they're backing me and obviously donating a little bit financially towards the channel as well. Now, in trade-off for all this, they are getting member benefits, such as the ones that you can get if you were to go down below the video and click join, or go on my main YouTube channel page and click join over there to show your devotion. Now, if you want to get things like Discord access, early members only content, or just looking at deck reviews and deck techs from yours truly, you can click that button and join the member list over here on the side. Now, of course, I would also love it if you could just tap that subscribe button so you can stay up to date on all sorts of metagame recaps like this, deck techs, and just in general, Magic the Gathering content from me. See you at the next Pro Tour.